Okay, so yesterday we had a panel around justice-involved youth where we heard from judge, law enforcement, prosecutors, and defense attorneys. So I know in your all's daily work, you're working with those entities as well as youth who have been involved in the justice system. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that work, what those collaborations with the justice system look like, and how taking a more trauma-informed approach could improve outcomes for the kids that you work with.
Well, as a pediatrician in Washington, D.C., and I serve in an urban environment, I have a small subset of patients, mostly teenagers, who are in and out of the justice system. One of the issues that I've come across is that when they are returned to their communities, there's a disconnect between the services that they've received while incarcerated and their medical home. Many times they receive psychiatric evaluations and are given new diagnoses and prescribed new medications and advised to follow up with certain specialists when they return to their communities, and that information is not communicated effectively with the parents, the child, or the pediatrician, and so there's a disconnect there.
Right, and it's a really critical point because we know that interface between the time they return to the community is really critical to whether there's going to be recidivism,
Right.
whether they're going to go on to be successful in school and sort of fully reintegrated back into the community. So making that seamless transition
It's
back
very
to their
important.
medical home and their medical provider would be critical. I know in your community, police community interactions can often be a cause of stress and trauma in the lives of the families that you serve. Could you talk a little bit about how that shows up in your patients?
You know, I think a lot of it is ingrained. It doesn't always come out in conversation. There is some tension between a lot of community members and the law enforcement officials. There is a degree of community policing. However, I believe a lot of my patients view police officers and law enforcement not as a resource, and there's a lot of association between police officers and really traumatic events. So maybe the last interaction a child had with a police officer was when their brother was shot, or the last interaction they had was when their father was arrested. And I think that if we can sort of change that dynamic, some of that ingrained trauma would be reduced.
What role does healthcare have in trying to bring that conversation forward between community and police?
At the clinic where I serve, we are seen as the medical home. We've been there for decades, longer than a lot of the schools and grocery stores and even some of the police departments have been there. So we are a trusted source. I think we could serve as a common ground to sort of bridge and open up communication between law enforcement and community members.
So Bob, I know in your work in Cincinnati, you're already working closely with law enforcement on child abuse investigations. Could you talk a little bit about that relationship and how some of the knowledge you bring to the table in terms of ACEs, in terms of trauma, has maybe impacted the work that law enforcement does?
Jeff, I think it's an interesting dynamic that we see, because when we're investigating a case of child abuse, we do it around a table that includes caseworkers from the county, prosecutors, and law enforcement officers, and we're all sharing notes and we're discussing exactly what happened here, what went wrong. And one of the most common scenarios that we discuss is what happened to the parents during their time as youth. And the social history that we have available to us at the time of a review includes things like child abuse of the parent when they were youth, about drug exposure, about a time when they were incarcerated as youth. And the team recognizes that oftentimes there could have been opportunities to change the outcome for those parents so that the cycle of abuse may not have repeated itself. And so through this work, we have an increased awareness, and we really do see it on a weekly basis. And it drives a desire and a work within the greater Cincinnati community to become more trauma-informed so that we might be able to find opportunities to intervene earlier to address the trauma that young adults are experiencing to break the cycle of abuse.
How do we begin to move this upstream to help do some of that prevention that we know will get them from ending up in the system in the first place?
So Jeff, I think we all know that moving this work upstream is difficult work, and it's slow and it takes time. And we find in Cincinnati that education and awareness is still needed on multiple levels, and so increasing education and awareness within the juvenile courts, within law enforcement, within children's services is really an essential and a first step. In Cincinnati, we have a collective impact organization called Joining Forces for Children, and that's the way that we do begin to tackle this problem within our initiative. After that, our goal is that those individuals expert in the court systems, in child protection and law enforcement, will identify and recognize ways through our help to implement evidence-informed or evidence-based changes within their own organization. There is no simple answer here. There is no one single thing that needs to change. It's a culture that needs to change that starts with awareness and then identifying what's plausible, what's possible. It's slow work, and I think building community resilience is really all about how we implement these kinds of changes on a community-wide basis.